floated on the swells, a sure sign of land. With hushed expectation, the men scanned the seas ahead.
Then, half an hour past noon, McCarthy raised the cheerful cry, "Land ho!" The thoughts uppermost were, "We've done it."
They had accomplished what many regard as the greatest small boat journey in the world. 800 miles across the stormiest seas on Earth in a 22-foot vessel.
It was a colossal achievement. When they saw the black peaks of South Georgia, huge relief and happiness, but the story was not quite over yet.
The winds suddenly rose. In their hour of triumph, safety slipped from their grasp. The boat was caught in the fury of hurricane-force winds. Shackleton despaired of ever reaching land.
The chance of surviving the night, with the driving gale and the implacable sea forcing us onto the lee shore, seemed small. I think most of us had a feeling that the end was very near.
And this is where Worsley came into his own, because he understood the way a sailing ship worked. And so he performed a miracle. Somehow he clawed his way offshore.
Worsley hauled the Caird away from the rocky coast to sit out the gale. By morning, the seas calmed, and Shackleton ordered the boat into shore.
I stood in the bows, directing the steering, as we ran through the kelp and made the passage of the reef. In a minute or two, we were inside. And the James Caird ran in on a swell and touched the beach.
What got the James Caird to South Georgia was a combination of luck and skill. The skill was Worsley's, this brilliant navigator, this wonderful small boat handler. But there is always the element of luck. And this is where we come to the great imponderable. Shackleton was a lucky man. He was lucky.
After 17 days at sea, the 6 men stumbled ashore to their long-sought haven. Relieved to be on solid ground, McNeish hobbled up the slope behind the cove.
The boss and skipper went away for a walk, and I went on top of the hill and had a lay on the grass. And it put me in mind of old times at home, sitting on the hillside, looking down at the sea.
But they would not rest for long. The Caird had landed on the wrong side of South Georgia. The whaling stations were on the opposite coast. By sea, Worsley reckoned it to be 150 miles. With the men weak and the Caird battered, there was only one alternative: to traverse the island to the closest inhabited station. Shackleton knew the risks only too well.
We had a very scanty knowledge of the conditions of the interior. No man had ever penetrated a mile from the coast of South Georgia, and the whalers, I knew, regarded the country as inaccessible.
The mountains and glaciers of the interior would not be mapped or photographed until years later. Shackleton prepared to depart, writing instructions for McNeish.
Sir, I'm about to try to reach the east coast of this island for relief of our party. I'm leaving you in charge of Vincent, McCarthy, and yourself. You will remain here until relief arrives in the event of my non-return. Yours faithfully, E.H. Shackleton.
But for 10 days, storms made the journey impossible. As Worsley observed, for Shackleton, the man of action, waiting was unbearable.
Meantime, the strain of waiting and anxiety for his men was telling on him. He was then nearer to depression than I'd ever known him. He said to me, "I'll never take another expedition, Skipper."
The fate of the men on Elephant Island weighed heavily on his mind.
Over on Elephant Island, 22 men were waiting for the relief that we alone could secure for them. Their plight was worse than ours. We must push on somehow.
On a narrow spit of land they called Cape Wild, Shackleton's men recorded their sufferings in their diaries.
Life here without a hut and equipment is almost beyond endurance. Such an inhospitable coast I have never beheld.
I think I spent this morning the most unhappy hour of my life. All attempts seemed so hopeless.
So passes another goddamn rotten day.
Men sat and cursed this island.
I am convinced they would starve or freeze if left to their own resources on this island.
The men who remained on Elephant Island, they had to wait. Waiting's always harder than acting. And this is where Frank Wilde came into his own. Wilde was a rather melancholy character because he had failings, he drank, he never quite made it ashore. But he was perfectly suited to holding the men together on Elephant Island. He was used to following orders. And his orders were to keep the men alive.
Exposed to the ravages of wind and sea, their prospects on this barren shore were grim. But Wilde refused to allow the men to surrender to despair.
Some of the party had become despondent and were in a what's the use sort of mood and had to be driven to work. None too gently either.
The treeless island offered no natural shelter. So Wilde mustered the crew to build one. With bleeding, frost-bitten hands, they cobbled a ramshackle hut from the 2 lifeboats and scraps of canvas. The men crowded into these quarters, barely 10 by 19 feet. The frozen ground was coated with penguin guano, and the smoking fire burned their eyes, but it shielded them from the elements. Each day, Wilde planned a strict regimen of duties to occupy their days.
He was aware of the vital importance of a routine. Previous expeditions in the last century, there had been alcoholism and suicide and insanity. They were all kept together pretty well, and that's leadership.
Wilde roused all hands at 9:30 daily for chores and hunting. Penguins supplied food and fuel for the stove. At day's end, they were busy still, writing in their diaries, reading aloud, and singing with Hussey on banjo.
He did keep them alive, and the reason he kept them alive because he kept them sane. And he was probably the one man, aside from Shackleton, who could have achieved that.
Most of all, Wilde kept hope alive through the days of waiting. The men showed their gratitude in an ode to their leader.
Me name is Frankie Wilde, oh, me hut's on Elephant Isle. The walls without a single brick, the roofs without a tile. But nevertheless, I must confess, by many a mile, it's the most palatial dwelling place you'll find on Elephant Isle. It's the most palatial dwelling place you'll find on Elephant Isle.
month had passed since the Caird left Elephant Island. As the polar winter approached, pack ice encircled the island. Wilde knew that a rescue ship could never break through. Still, every day, he ordered his men to pack up and stow.
Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today.
But rescue was still remote. Shackleton's trek across the no-man's land of South Georgia was just beginning. With screws in their boot soles for traction, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean prepared to travel light for speed, with only 3 days' food, leaving the tent and sleeping bags behind.
The crossing of South Georgia posed almost insuperable difficulties. They didn't have the proper equipment, their clothes were threadbare. But worse than that, they'd been cooped up on this boat for a fortnight, so that they were anything but fit. Their limbs weren't even working properly. It was almost like astronauts coming back to Earth.
To find their way, they had only a compass and a map of the island, showing nothing more than an outline of the coast. By dawn, the 3 men reached high ground, and Shackleton glimpsed the interior for the first time. It was an unnerving sight.
The interior was tremendously broken. High peaks, impassable cliffs, steep snow slopes, and sharply descending glaciers were prominent features in all directions.
The sheer, icy crags in their path rose to nearly 4,000 feet. For 3 weak, malnourished men, it was as daunting as Everest.
I can't even begin to feel how it would be for them with just the bare minimum gear that they had. Here we are fully equipped with everything, and I still get scared.
Among the few permanent residents of South Georgia, Tim and Pauline Carr have followed in Shackleton's footsteps.
Well, one of the big problems was that their screws that McNeish had put into the soles of their boots had all but worn out. They had to go down this very steep slope by cutting steps, and all they had between them was a ship's carpenter's adze. They get a little bit of an edge in there, foot on there, and then a foot in there. And these were tired men. They didn't want to mess around doing that, but it was the only way down.
After climbing for 15 grueling hours, Shackleton and his companions left the mountains behind. But a new danger lay ahead. The landscape was a maze of crevasses. One misstep could send them plunging to their deaths.
Shackleton, Crean and Worsley, they immediately saw that they had some crevasses to negotiate, and therefore they would be something like this, 50 feet deep. If one of them fell in one of these crevasses, they probably would have jeopardized their whole crossing.
For protection, all they had was a length of fraying rope from the cairn.
They would have had to have roped up before crossing these glaciers. They would have had their natural fiber alpine rope and took an end of it like this, got it around their waist, and being nautical as well, they probably would have done a bowline fairly close in to the waist like that. Dependable knot, and then if they had have fallen, they'd just take right up like that, and probably would have been pulled out by the other two, but sore arms and sore chest in the bargain, I think.
They struggled over a seemingly endless span of glaciers. Their frozen clothing brushing stiff against their raw skin. the exhausted men marched for 26 hours straight. When Shackleton allowed them to rest, Worsley and Crean fell instantly asleep.
It will be disastrous if we all slumbered together, for sleep under such conditions merges into death. After 5 minutes, I shook them into consciousness, told them that they had slept for half an hour, and gave the word for a fresh start.
The weary men continued to climb. Shackleton guessed they might be just 5 miles from Stromness whaling station. When he thought he heard the morning whistle, they all strained to listen.
We watched the chronometer for 7 o'clock, when the whalers will be summoned to work. Right to the minute the steam whistle came to us, borne clearly on the wind across miles of rock and snow. It was the first sound created by outside human agency that had come to our ears since we left in 1914. Pain and ache, boat journeys, marches, hunger and fatigue seemed to belong to the limbo of forgotten things.
Just before the Endurance departed, Shackleton visited here at the home of the station manager to celebrate his coming adventure. Now, the manager answered the door and stared at the 3 haggard strangers, clad in rags and grimed with soot, and asked, "Who are you?"
Don't you know me? My name is Shackleton.
17 months had passed since Shackleton and his men vanished into the Antarctic. Within hours, a blizzard swept over South Georgia. Shackleton's legendary luck had been on their side. Now, he hoped it would hold.
When Shackleton reached safety at Stromness, he still had 3 men waiting for him on the other side of the island. Next priority, well, the immediate priority was to save them. That was no problem. They got a whaler, fetched them. But then he was obsessed, if that's the word, preoccupied with saving the men left behind on Elephant Island, and he would not rest until he had saved them.
All of Stromness mobilized for the rescue mission. The station manager offered a ship and volunteers for the crew. Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean departed South Georgia, bound for Elephant Island. But within days, they encountered pack ice. The Caird had navigated these waters just a month before. Now, they were impassable to a steel steamship. Defeated by his old nemesis, Shackleton reluctantly turned back to port. The British Navy offered a ship, but Shackleton insisted on mounting his own rescue mission. He borrowed a fishing vessel and planned a new attempt. Worsley observed,
"His anxiety for his men was so great that he couldn't rest. In those terrible months, I saw deep lines appear on his face. People thought that Shackleton was mad to enter the winter ice with such a weak vessel.
Locked in battle with the floes, the ship stopped short just 20 miles from Elephant Island. Again, Shackleton's hopes of a swift rescue were dashed. It could be months before the winter pack ice retreated, but for Wild and his men, time was running out. Young Perce Blackborough was gravely ill. His frostbitten toes had blackened and swelled. To save Blackborough's life, Dr. Alexander Macklin and Surgeon James McElroy were compelled to take action. They had no option but to operate in the crowded squalor of the hut.
Well, my grandfather was quite ill, gangrene on his toes. They needed to come off straight away. They found some chloroform, very little. They thought they didn't have any. They were going to operate without it at first, but they did find some in one of the packing cases. And they raised the temperature of inside the boat. And they proceeded to take my grandfather's toes off. The poor beggar never flinched.
Blackborough's crewmates fared little better. All were severely malnourished, and one man had suffered a heart attack. Wilde fought to rally their flagging hopes.
Well, boys, patience for another week. The relief ship can't get through the pack.
He is always saying that the ship will be here next week. But of course he says this just to keep up the spirits of those who are likely to become despondent.
Thomas Ord Lees expressed the fears the men fought to keep at bay. His was a lonely and ridiculed voice in a band of desperate optimists.
He played a part which is quite essential in any group. He was the scapegoat. He was the man everybody loved to hate. And this is most essential because it's quite important in keeping the cohesion of the group and also in keeping people's sanity. You must have somebody to hate.
Ord Lees warned rightly that game was becoming scarce and urged Wilde to build up their reserves. But, like Shackleton, Wilde argued that it would destroy morale, signaling to the men that they would be stranded indefinitely.
If I was there on the ice, I'd back my grandfather any old time because, you know, you don't live on morale. You know, you need food, not morale, to survive in the Antarctic for 18 months.
Ord Lees' nagging pessimism became more insistent as the weeks wore on. With his men on the brink of collapse, Wilde felt compelled to act.
I had to threaten to shoot him, to make him keep his tongue between his teeth.
But threats couldn't disguise the grim reality that the men confided to their diaries. The few stray penguins were not enough to stave off starvation. They were forced to dig up discarded scraps of putrid meat for food. Wilde could no longer keep hope of rescue alive. By August 30th, the castaways were reduced to boiling bones for sustenance. Frank Hurley and artist George Marston waded to the shore. They plunged bare arms into the icy surf for a few tiny shellfish to calm their gnawing hunger. Suddenly, Hurley pointed out to sea.
I called Marston's attention to a curious piece of ice on the horizon, which bore a striking resemblance to a ship. We immediately called out, "Ship-o!"
Marston shouted to Wilde.
Wilde, there's a ship. Hadn't we better light a flare?
The men scrambled to the beach. Worsley at his side, Shackleton rowed toward the island.
We saw tiny black figures hurry to the beach and wave signals to us. As I came nearer, I called out, "Are you all well?" And Wilde answered, "We are all well, boss."
Shackleton had fulfilled his ambition to save each and every man. They were headed for home. At last. Worsley remarked of their reunion,
We got them aboard at 1 p.m. And at 1 a.m., there was not a drop of liquor left. The poor fellows deserved the good time.
Days later, the rescue ship steamed triumphantly to port in Chile, to a hero's welcome. It had been 21 months since they sailed from civilization. Shackleton cabled his wife, Emily.
I have done it. Not a life lost, and we have been through hell. Soon I will be home, and then I will rest. Give my love and kisses to the children.
In 1916, the survivors of the Endurance returned to a Europe transformed by World War I.
We were like men arisen from the dead to a world gone mad. Our minds accustomed themselves gradually to the tales of nations in arms, of deathless courage and unimagined slaughter, of a world conflict that had grown beyond all conception.
It was Shackleton's misfortune that this expedition took place during the Great War, because when he got home, his achievement was overshadowed by greater events elsewhere.
The death of so many people in the trenches in the war made them feel that they had been, I could have said, nearly cowards, that they had avoided 2 years of the war and they were lucky to be alive.
Shackleton and many of the crew rushed to enlist. Within a month of his return to England, Tim McCarthy, able seaman of the James Caird, was killed in action. Shackleton campaigned for royal recognition of his officers and crew, but their heroism seemed to pale in the public mind beside the tragic sacrifices of war. Finally, in 1918, the men of the Endurance were awarded the Polar Medal for exemplary service. Sailors Holness, Stevenson, and Vincent failed to receive the prize, likely for disobeying orders. The honor was also withheld from Chippy McNeish.
In my opinion, they would never have got back home if it hadn't been for Chippy McNeish. What he done with the James Caird. He built the James Caird up. Chippy McNeish brought them home, and I don't care what anybody says. Chippy McNeish brought them home.
When all's said and done, he was the man who saved them all by making the boat journey possible, yet he was the man who mutinied on the ice. For that, Shackleton never forgave him. Because in Shackleton's book, one single act of disloyalty outweighed anything else a man might do in a lifetime.
For most of Shackleton's men, the bond of loyalty endured. When he threw off the humdrum of everyday life for a new expedition in 1921, 8 veterans of the Endurance answered the boss's call. Among them, Frank Worsley, Frank Wild, and Alexander Macklin. Shackleton was bound for the Antarctic once again. The Quest steered a southerly course with her crew of restless spirits. The stated aim was the circumnavigation of the Antarctic continent. But Shackleton and Wild reminisced and hatched grand schemes of someday hunting for pirate treasure. As the ship neared her destination, Shackleton grew pensive, recalling the adventures of his younger days.
Anxiety has been probing deeply into me. Ah, me. The years that have gone, since in the pride of young manhood I first went forth to the fight. I grow old and tired, but must always lead on.
The sighting of South Georgia conjured glimpses of past glories. Going ashore, Shackleton celebrated this homecoming with the whalers of Grytviken. In the glow of sunset, he rejoined the ship, swaying at anchor in the harbor.
I find a difficulty in settling down to write. A wonderful evening. In the darkening twilight, I saw a lone star hover, gem-like, above the bay.
Later, Dr. Macklin was called to his side. The ailing Shackleton had always laughed off his friend's warnings about hard times and high living.
You're always wanting me to give up things. What is it I ought to give up now?
Moments later, his heart failed, and he died in Macklin's arms. Shackleton was 47. At his wife's request, he was laid to rest in South Georgia, in the Grytviken Whalers Cemetery.
Grandfather was, I think, happiest in the Antarctic. He wrote once to my grandmother, "I'm not much good at anything else but being an explorer." It was right that my grandfather was buried in South Georgia, scene of his greatest achievements in plucking triumph from disaster. And the gateway of the part of the world that meant most to him, the Antarctic. I cannot think of a better place.
His sorrowing men built a memorial overlooking the bay, where the Endurance set out on her fateful voyage. Worsley was lost in memories.
It seemed to me that among his achievements, great as they were, his one failure was the most glorious.
We had pierced the veneer of outside things. We had suffered, starved, and triumphed. Grovelled down, yet grasped at glory. Grown bigger in the bigness of the whole. We had seen God in his splendors, heard the text that nature renders. We had reached the naked soul of man.
On NOVA's website, explore the panoramic images of South Georgia and its waters, and journey to places virtually unchanged in the decades since Shackleton's expedition on pbs.org or America Online keyword PBS. Educators can order this or any other NOVA program for $19.95 plus shipping and handling. Call WGBH Boston Video at 1-800-255-9424.
Coming in April on NOVA. Anatomy of a Disaster. What really caused the Twin Towers to collapse? What does this tell us about the safety of all tall buildings? Why the towers fell?
NOVA is a production of WGBH Boston. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television.
This program is funded in part by the Northwestern Mutual Foundation. Some people already know Northwestern Mutual can help plan for your children's education. Are you there yet? Northwestern Mutual Financial Network.
Science. It's given us the framework to help make wireless communications clear. Sprint PCS is proud to support NOVA.
Morgan Stanley is proud to support Shackleton's Voyage of Endurance.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is PBS.
Broadcast support for NOVA is provided in part by Vermont Yankee, providing the electrical energy that Vermonters have relied upon for more than a quarter century. By the Fuel and Utility Systems Division of Goodrich Corporation in Vergennes. The Goodrich Corporation has been a significant contributor to education in Vermont for more than 50 years. Additional funding is provided by contributing Vermont Public Television members like you. You're watching viewer-supported Vermont Public Television, where you belong.
Vermont Public Television is walking a tightrope, balancing the need to meet its financial obligations and to preserve the programs and services you've come to rely on. You may have received some mail from us recently asking for your help. It might be asking for an additional gift, or your renewal gift, or asking you to become a member for the first time. I hope you'll do whatever you can to support the programs and services that VPT provides in our community.
Good morning. You're watching Vermont Public Television, owned and operated by Vermont ETV Incorporated, with studios located in 40th and Allen, Colchester, Vermont. Vermont Public Television operates stations WEA, the transmitter on Mount Mansfield in Stowe in the 584 to 590 megahertz band with an effective
543669 or by email llee@vpt.org. This is a trip you will not want to miss.
As the war between the Israelis and the Palestinians intensified, Frontline goes behind the lines on both sides. How did this conflict, once fought with stones, become an all-out battle for the Holy Land?
Tune in Thursday night at 9 on Vermont Public Television.
Broadcast of the American Experience on Vermont Public Television is supported in part by the Lane Press, printer since 1904, providing full production and distribution services for magazines and catalogs. By Cellular One, Vermont's provider of cellular paging and long-distance services. Cellular One reminds you, whenever you're on the road with your wireless phone, your first responsibility is to drive safely. By Page Designs, Burlington's award-winning socially responsible creative communication firm, offering graphic design, writing, and website development services that help businesses in the Northeast grow and thrive. Funding has also been provided by contributing members like you.
Greed.
It was mighty easy to make a living with cotton, and you had the benefit of human labor there that was about as inexpensive as you could get.
Betrayal.
Although he does not admit it, he had to know right then his father had betrayed him. It betrayed him personally.
And fear.
First come, first served with the whites. Blacks got the end of the land.
All thrown together by a deadly force of nature. Fatal Flood. Tonight on American Experience. American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
Liberty Mutual Insurance is a proud supporter of the American Experience. And by helping people live safer, more secure lives, we're also proud supporters of the American Dream.
At the Scotts Company, we help make gardens more beautiful, lawns greener, trees taller. If there's a better business to be in, please let us know.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, the winter of 27, it started raining early in the year that year. January, February. Rain seemed like every day.
It rained and rained and rained and rained some more. It just looked like it would never stop.
The river kept coming above flood level. And it was rumored in all of the papers and things that if this levee would break, we would have a flood that would wash away from Memphis to New Orleans.
On April 15th, 1927, Good Friday, as another violent storm battered Greenville, Mississippi, a party was held in one of the town's finest homes. As the rain intensified, guests were drawn to the windows. Just beyond their view, the Mississippi River was rising to unprecedented heights. A burst of thunder shook the house and the party fell silent. All eyes turned to one man, Leroy Percy. The former senator was one of the most powerful planters in the Mississippi Delta. Senator Percy, one woman asked, will the levees hold? Percy gathered a group of men and rushed to the levee protecting Greenville from the river. The levee was holding, but barely. Staring at the angry water, Percy could see that an epic battle was looming, pitting man against nature. What he couldn't see was that a human storm was also approaching. One that would pit money against honor, black man against white, even father against son. Delta. Fear God and the Mississippi, a saying goes. The river punishes with great destruction and rewards with great wealth. Its floodwaters leave behind some of the most lush and fertile soil on Earth. For half a century after the Civil War, Delta planters had been richly rewarded by the river. By the early 1900s, they presided over one of the most productive cotton-growing regions in the world. In an age when cotton was king, self-styled planter aristocrats ruled their domains like feudal lords. The most ambitious of them all was Leroy Percy. His empire extended far beyond the cotton fields to the boardrooms of railroads and banks. As a prominent lawyer and businessman, he was determined to bring the plantation economy into the 20th century.
Leroy Percy saw the Delta, I think, as this great, bursting, industrial region. But the industry in the Delta was agriculture. That did not mean that it would be any less efficient than a northern factory. It would operate with every bit as much efficiency. And of course, the labor was the key to that.
It was mighty easy to make a living with cotton. And you had the benefit of human labor there that was about as inexpensive as you could get. And these big plantations, they would have thousands of blacks that worked there. I mean, you couldn't raise it without the blacks. Without human labor there, he couldn't exist. Not only important, it was vital.
The plantation system offered African Americans work, but very little else. Most families scraped out a living from sharecropping. The planters provided a small plot of land. Everything else was advanced on credit and deducted from the workers' share of the crop. It was a system ripe for abuse.
It was known on some plantations that the only thing that the people gathered in life was what you would call 3 M's, meat, meal, and molasses. And they would work from sun up until sundown. And when the season was over, the only thing they had left was an indebtment of $400 or $500, something they couldn't afford. Because the white owners say during the time that they worked for that season, they had used up all the meat, meal, and molasses. But they had nothing. And when I say nothing, I mean nothing.
The planters looked at black people as workers. They looked at black people as people who should be willing and eager to work for them to produce their cotton. And when they weren't eager, they could be coerced.
Well, I won't call his name, but there was a plantation owner that carried a bull whoop all the time. And he spoke with that whoop. And I've seen him beat the blacks on Washington Avenue because they didn't get out of his way.
Like his fellow planters, Leroy Percy feared losing his black labor force. But unlike many, he believed the best way to keep African Americans in the Delta was to treat them fairly. Decency, Percy insisted, was part of the Southern Code of Honor.
The Percys had a sense of noblesse oblige. They thought of themselves as having more empathy with people of African descent. They saw themselves as being more understanding, more tolerant of them, more friendly with them. They saw themselves as being noblesse oblige incarnate.
They were real business people, the Percys were real business people. They knew that their livelihood came from the blacks. So why destroy what makes your money? That's how I looked at them. So it was all business.
In 1910, Leroy Percy took his views on race relations and business to Washington when he was appointed to a vacant Senate seat. A year later, Percy ran for re-election against a bitter political enemy. Former Mississippi Governor James K. Vardaman was a populist and an unapologetic racist. If it is necessary, he warned, every Negro in the state will be lynched to maintain white supremacy. Vardaman defeated Percy in a landslide.
The effect of the defeat of 1911 on Leroy Percy was to send him into the deepest gloom he'd probably ever experienced. He felt that he had let down the side, so to speak, that his honor had been violated, because not only had he lost the election, but he'd come in third, a sitting senator coming in third.
Retreating to Washington County, Leroy resumed his work and consoled himself with the diversions of a country gentleman.
Leroy was a classic man's man. Hunted, fished, played poker, and he knew how to operate. He was not naive about anything. And as his son said, no one ever made the mistake of thinking he wasn't dangerous.
Leroy's commanding personality was altogether different from that of his only son and heir, William Alexander Percy. Soft-spoken and introspective, Will was ill-suited to the stringent code of Southern manhood.
He felt himself an outsider almost from the start. He worshipped his father. He thought he was the grandest man and the most heroic that one could possibly have. At the same time, he thought, I'll never be like him, and I should. It's my duty as a Percy to be as much like my father as possible. But he couldn't. It wasn't in his nature.
He was smaller physically. He saw no pleasure whatsoever in hunting or fishing. Would never go on these trips. Even as a young boy, he wouldn't go with his father. He was a poet. And he was gay.
Will had tried to live up to his father's expectations. He went to Harvard, earned a law degree, served with valor in World War I, and joined his father's law practice in Greenville. But in his own mind, he never measured up. It was hard having such a dazzling father, Will recalled. No wonder I longed to be a hermit. Will often walked alone on the levee, his thoughts turning to poetry. What I wrote, he explained, seemed more essentially myself than anything I did or said.
Will Percy wrote a piece called Falling Leaves, and he wrote about how he was walking along the river bank, and he says, I know it is fall because I am loneliest now. I go home to my family, and I see my mother pacing up and down, and my father saying, hush, don't say those things. It's a very moving piece of writing, but it indicates how he recognized his parents' dissatisfaction with him and his inability to do anything about it, and even to speak of it was impossible.
Despite his feelings, Will continued to live in his father's house on Percy Street, placing the family empire above his own happiness. In the spring of 1922, that empire would come under direct attack. The Ku Klux Klan was gaining ground throughout the country. Klan supporters dominated the state governments of Colorado and Indiana. They helped elect the governors of a dozen states. By the 1920s, the Klan had swept over the Mississippi Hill Country and several counties in the Delta. They now challenged Leroy Percy in his own domain. Percy despised the Klan. They attacked those closest to him. His wife was a Catholic, his business partner a Jew. His empire was dependent on black labor. When he learned of a planned Klan rally in Greenville, Leroy decided to fight back. On March 1st, 1922, a tense crowd packed the Greenville courthouse. The Klansman spoke first.
The Klansman starts out with his usual spiel. He's against the Catholics. The Pope's got this plot here. The Jews are doing that. The blacks are a threat to Southern womanhood. It was a rousing speech. It had never been opposed.
Will watched his father step up to the podium. No one knew what to expect.
He starts out with humor. He goes on to say that he's got a partner who's a Jew, and he agrees that the Jews need to be held in line because he points out that his Jewish partner had loaned $150,000 to people who lived in Washington County at below market interest rates. And Percy had a real problem with that. So all of a sudden he's got the audience laughing, and he starts mocking the Klan. And in the end, however, he gets serious.
I know the terror the Klan embodies for our Negro population, Percy declared, and I am here to plead against it. We have feasted together at the weddings of our young people. We have stood together around the graves of our loved ones. We have stood together and undivided.
And he asked even the Klansmen, he said, we want you to come home, come back to this community, leave the Klan. It was just a tremendous speech.
At the close of Father's speech, Will wrote, the crowd went wild, shouting and cheering. That evening, they passed a resolution condemning the Klan.
This didn't happen anywhere else in the South. That the leadership of a rural community would stand up and confront and defeat the Ku Klux Klan at that period is unprecedented.
Our town was saved,
Will wrote. Righteousness had prevailed. Leroy's victory had brought the Percys closer together, uniting them with a sense of honor and purpose. But the Mississippi River would soon threaten Greenville and test the bond between father and son. In the autumn of 1926, violent storms pelted the northern United States, engorging streams and rivers. The arteries drained south, funneling the waters of a continent into the Mississippi. By March 1927, huge swells reached the top of the delta. Greenville was only 100 miles downriver.
Just imagine a force that's more than a mile wide, maybe 100 feet deep, and it's moving at 9 miles an hour. Think of what's behind that. Clearly, it's something to be feared. I mean, it's the greatest geological force in the United States.
It was a force the Army Corps of Engineers thought it could control. The Corps had built levees, some 4 stories high, on both banks of the river, running the 1,100-mile span from Cairo, Illinois, to New Orleans.
If you looked at these levees at low water, they look like great impregnable fortresses. In 1926, for the first time in the official report of the Army engineers, they say that they are now in a position to prevent the damaging impact of floods on the lower Mississippi Valley. Classic hubris.
April brought record downpours. By the middle of the month, the first government-built levee crumbled in Dorena, Missouri. The surge of water pushed south, bursting more levees, flooding more than 1 million acres of land and leaving 50,000 people homeless. The Delta was next.
So here comes this crest down the river at such a volume that some rivers are actually backing up because the Mississippi is so full of water that, for example, the Arkansas River, it starts flowing backward because the Mississippi is so high, it pushes it back. So that's the kind of water we're talking about, this enormous amount of water coming down the river.
When that river gets to the top of the levee and is lapping over, it is guarded. Arkansas people guard the levee against Mississippi people. Mississippi people guard the levee against the Arkansas people. Afraid somebody will blow the levee and turn the water loose on the other side. If I blow your side of the levee, you're going to get washed off the face of the earth, and I'm going to stay dry. Because the water didn't come my way. It went your way.
The wall of water kept pushing south. Levees began to collapse along the Arkansas River. It was already the worst flood on record, and it was aiming all its force at Greenville.
In desperation, Percy and his fellow planters pulled their workers from the fields to do battle with the river. They became part of an army of 30,000 men, including convicts, who struggled to raise the height of the levees with rows of sandbags. Still, the river continued to rise.
When even more men were needed on the levees, Greenville's police resorted to force.
They start going through Greenville and taking all of the black men. This is another thing that I can remember so plainly. All of the black people, even kids out of school, to go and protect the levee. And almost man for man, or boy for boy, the whites had guns on, and the others had nothing but picks and shovels.
They had shotguns. They just hurried them up and drove them to the levee. Right down Nelson Street, that was the Negro drag at the time, and they just got them off the streets and just carried them right down to the levee and taught them to work.
White residents began to panic. Those who could afford it boarded trains leaving the region.
Upriver from Greenville, at a great bend in the river, the Mounds Landing levee was showing signs of trouble.
On Good Friday, the Delta was battered by the most savage storm of them all. As much as 15 inches of rain fell in 18 hours. One resident recorded in his diary, "Heaven spare us."
The Mounds Landing levee was beginning to crumble.
It's cold, damp, rainy. The break is increasing. The water's washing over top of the levee. And according to some accounts, the levee starts feeling loose.
The water started rising an inch an hour. That's fast. That's 2 feet a day. There is a limit to how high you can build sandbags.
They didn't think it was going to hold. In fact, it was getting worse by the minute. They throwing all the sandbags in there they could, and just kept getting bigger and bigger, and they couldn't stop it.
The men working on the sandbags know full well there's no way that this thing is going to hold. And they start to abandon the position. And the National Guard officer orders rifles held on them and threatens to shoot them if they leave.
And these fellows were filling their sacks with sand. And my stepfather, he noticed that at the bottom of the levee, some water started coming out. And he grabbed my hand, grabbed my arm, I guess, and he said, "Run, Johnny boy. Run for your life."
And levee starts shaking and rumble. And men start running, and all of a sudden, a big section of the levee, several hundred feet wide, just sort of pushes out and carries men with it.
It was him screaming, yelling, blood-curdling yells. And they were gone. So you've let the Mississippi out. And you could almost hear it yelling. It's free. I'm free again. And man, it came out with a roar. My stepfather said to me, he said, God damn. He said, remember, Johnny boy, you'll have a lot of close calls in your life. You're not going to have any closer one than this one tonight.
The break at Mound's Landing released more than double the volume of Niagara Falls. It flooded an area 50 miles wide and 100 miles long. It put water over the tops of houses in Yazoo City, 75 miles away. The deluge was cascading south through the cotton fields of Washington County. It was only a matter of hours before the water reached Greenville, inundating the city from the rear. Leroy Percy now faced total disaster. The river was seizing his empire. Up in his room, Leroy's son was writing poetry. Will had been working feverishly through the night. I was in a writer's tantrum, he would later confess. The water rolled toward Greenville, wiping out forests and farms.
It was a sight to see, there's no doubt about it. It's hard to describe. It just had a force to it. It was just...
Oh, my Lord. This comes from every situation. I was so scared, I didn't know what had happened. I'll tell you the truth, I didn't know. Come late that evening, and you couldn't see nothing but water. And you have people hollering, you know, scared and running every way, you know. And people get in their boats and things, go searching for them, you know.
When it got light enough for us to see, you could see horses, cows, and dogs, and everything else right in that water drowning. I thought we was all going to drown.
The flood finally reached Greenville in the early morning hours of Friday, April 22nd.
I looked at it and said, oh, I see it coming. It's coming. And it was creeping into the gutters, but it was coming fast. Not heavy waves, just seeping in. But I tell you, seeping in a hurry.
10 feet of water inundated downtown. The current at the intersection of Broadway and Main turned deadly.
You could just see the livestock floating dead in the waters. And you know, young children at that time knew everybody's horse and everybody's cow. You say, there goes Mr. Fowler's cow, there goes Mr. Williams' horse, you know, just bloated and floating.
Some residents found safety in the upper floors of stores and churches. Others clung to rooftops. Anyone with a boat was pressed into service.
I had a sea sled at that time with about a 25 or 30 horsepower motor, and I became a rescue captain, which was a great event for me at that time, 14. And so every day we had assigned certain routes, and we'd go out, pick these people up, bring them back to the high ground, and keep going on my route. But I saw these three people, two kids, and what I thought was a very fat black woman on top of a cotton house. And as she got in, She said, "'Fore God, my baby's coming." I said, "What'd you say, ma'am?" He said, "'Fore God, my baby's coming." Well, I said, "Can't you just wait, hold it 40 minutes?" I said, I get it to the high ground, and they look after you. She said, "No," so said, "He's coming now." And I thought, what in the world do I do? And she said, "Don't worry," said, "just be real gentle with him." Said, "Just take his head and pull him slowly." And said, "He'll come on out. I'll push." And she pushed and I pulled. And here was a little baby boy. I then dipped him in the Mississippi River, the flood water, and hit him a couple of times. And he started crying. And she said, "Give him to me. I'll take him on my breast." And she lay down. She was still in the dirty water. And she took his baby, put him on her breast. Well, I think I cried. So I remember. My first experience of being a midwife. Anyway, I untied the boat. And when we got close to the high ground, I hollered at him. I said, "Look, I've got a new baby, just born." I got the mother up, and as she stepped out of the boat, she turned to me and said, "What's your name, son?" I said, "John." She said, "I'm going to name this baby John." That's the last I saw of her. An amazing woman. Listen. An amazing woman.
For 36 hours, the Delta was in turmoil, in movement, in terror, Will wrote. Then the water covered everything, and a great quiet settled down. Father looked somberly over the drowning town, Will noted. He was tired. But there was work to do. Leroy immediately began raising money for his devastated community and appointed his son head of the Flood Relief Committee. The task before Will was enormous. Up until now, Will was known only for being his father's son. Now, at age 42, he would have the chance to prove himself worthy of the Percy name. Within days, the deluge had covered 27,000 square miles, an area the size of 4 New England states. The flood, one preacher said, had spread as wide as God's arms. More than 1,000 people were dead. Washington County was hardest hit. The water washed away 2,200 buildings, damaged or destroyed thousands more. It displaced tens of thousands of people.
We lose a few clothes and furniture, so we lose everything we had. What little we had, didn't nobody had too much, but whatever, it mean a whole lot to you because you didn't have nothing else.
As the rescue efforts expanded, rowboats and skiffs followed power lines to farms and houses. Many whites were evacuated from the region. Blacks were rounded up from the countryside and deposited on Greenville's levee, a narrow island of high ground with the river on one side and flooded land on the other. 2 days after the Mound's Landing break, more than 10,000 refugees crammed the 8-foot-wide crown of the levee in a line that stretched over 5 miles.
There were no tents to start with. There was just a few blankets. And you can see them stretching blankets across a little frame to try to make a tent-like place to stay out of the weather, which was really bad. It was April, it was rainy, it was cold. These people had been out in rescue boats. It was miserable.
The city's water supply was contaminated, its food supply destroyed. With no sanitation facilities, the refugees were at risk for typhoid and cholera. For Will Percy, there was only one honorable course to take. Evacuate the black refugees to safer havens downriver. Will immediately called a meeting of the town's relief committee. Convinced that he spoke for his father, the committee agreed to Will's call for an evacuation order.
When a group of planters learned of the plan, they were furious. Afraid that they would lose their workers, they demanded that Will rescind the order.
The planters reasoned that if these people ever got away, they may never come back. They wanted to ensure that they had laborers to try to finish out the cotton crop if the water went down that year. And this was a perfect example of that mentality that Mississippi planters had. It didn't really matter if these people were uncomfortable. It didn't really matter if they were starving. And it probably wouldn't have really mattered a whole lot if a lot of them had died for one reason or another. They were going to keep their laborers, and that's this ruthless contempt for human beings.
Will was appalled by the planters' demands and refused to budge. Undaunted, they took their case directly to his father.
The next morning, Leroy Percy went searching for his son.
Leroy finds Will on the levee. It's a war scene. There are refugees everywhere. They begin to take a walk. Leroy is suggesting gently that perhaps the evacuation was not the best decision to make. Will is saying it's the only decision. Leroy disagrees. Will is stubborn, insists there's no way he could do anything else. While they are talking, 500 white women and children are loaded on one of the barges, and the loading of the blacks has begun. Steamers and barges had come from all over the river. There are enough steamers essentially to evacuate the entire city in a day. The captains are told to stand by. Finally, Leroy gets out of Will one concession, that he will meet with that committee once again to discuss the decision before everyone is loaded.
Then, without Will's knowledge, Leroy approached each member of the relief committee. He, too, feared that an exodus of blacks would prove disastrous.
His son, he said, had spoken only for himself. When the committee reconvened a few hours later, they dealt Will a stunning blow. To a man, the members now oppose the evacuation.
Although he does not admit it, he had to know right then, at that moment, that the only way this committee reversed itself was because his father had betrayed him, had betrayed him personally, had chosen Washington County and the empire he had built over his son. The evacuation is canceled. The steamboats that are standing by leave empty. Every captain absolutely infuriated over the waste of time and resources.
For Will, it was a wrenching moment. Ever since he was a young boy, he had tried to live up to his father's ideals of honor and decency. Now, those principles seemed to have lost their meaning. The next day, April 26th, an emissary from the federal government was on his way to Greenville. Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover. He was in charge of coordinating what had become the largest rescue and relief operation in the nation's history. There were 600,000 refugees in the flood region. Food, supplies, and medical care would come from the Red Cross, which was setting up tent cities on high ground. By the time Hoover arrived in Greenville, he was expecting to see an evacuation underway. But when he met the younger Percy on the levee, Will proposed a completely different plan. Greenville would become a Red Cross distribution hub. The blacks on the levee would provide the labor. Hoover approved the new plan, then left town. For the whites who remained in Greenville, daily life was settling into a dreary routine. A boardwalk was built throughout the downtown area. Some merchants opened up their doors for business. For African Americans, life was very different. The lucky few found shelter in towns. Most others were herded into tent cities, patrolled by the National Guard.
When you was on the levee, you stayed on the levee unless you got a pass to be able to go into town. You had to have a tag on you. You was tagged. When you got ready to give you a shot, you had to get another tag. Your chest was full of tags. You didn't go nowhere unless you got permission to go. You had to have a tag on you. And it was really slavery.
Some guardsmen began to abuse their power. Reports spread of beatings and rapes in the tent cities. Blacks outside the camps were infuriated, but powerless to help.
My brother come down there to see about us, but he couldn't come into camp. So I went down in the bushes to see him. And while I was down there, one of them soldiers walked up on me. Get up. Put the pistol on. And my brother had a pistol too. Now my brother wasn't a refugee, but my brother put the pistol on him and made him leave me alone. And of course my brother hit the road, came on back to Greenville. But it was some awful times.
A week into the flood, life in the camp was becoming unbearable. Beyond the lines of tents, thousands of starving livestock shared the narrow stretch of levee. Dead animals were thrown into the foul water. The stench was overwhelming. When the first Red Cross supplies arrived in Greenville, they were not distributed on the basis of need.
The whites would take what they wanted or give it to who they want. Naturally, the whites had better means of getting it.
First come, first served with the whites. Blacks, they were at the end of the line. They got whatever was left. Sometimes there was nothing left.
The National Red Cross grew concerned about Will's leadership and launched a secret investigation into profiteering and theft in Washington County.
Will lost control of the situation. There were ultimately 154 refugee camps run by the Red Cross. Greenville, Mississippi became the single worst refugee camp of 154.
Leroy Percy was not there to help his son. He was crisscrossing the country trying to rebuild the Delta's finances. To falter or fail now, he warned, would mean the abandonment of an empire. In June, 2 months after the Mound's Landing break, the flood finally started to recede. Some residents began returning to their homes. More and more boatloads of Red Cross supplies were now arriving on the levee. Will desperately needed laborers to unload the cargo. Once again, city blacks were pressed into work gangs.
They forced them into the service, and I think they could have gotten enough without it. But that was the only way they knew, and that was the quick way to do it, by force.
I became a dictator, Will recalled. But the consciousness that my judgments were often wrong was a continuing nightmare.
There was just all this internal hostility. He could not take this frustration out on his father. Will had been humiliated, and in his humiliation, he began to humiliate the black men and women and children on the levee. And there was no place else for this frustration to go.
An influential black newspaper proclaimed that Will Percy's prejudice against blacks is as bitter as gall.
2.5 months into the flood, racial tensions came to a boil.
There was one black gentleman who had actually just gotten off the levee after working all night. He'd gone back to his house to sleep. The police were going through the black neighborhoods looking for men to bring back to the levee. A police officer went up to this gentleman on his porch and told him to get in the truck.
He told him, "You go to work," and the answer was, "No, I've been to work." So he says, "You're supposed to work, go when I tell you." And the man got up to go in the house, and he shot him down on his front porch. And I don't think it was a black person with dry eyes in that town.
All of a sudden, the whole city is electrified, incredibly tense over all of this. There is real fear in the white community who are vastly outnumbered that there is going to be a race war.
Will Percy marched into the center of the storm. He called a meeting of the black community at a local church. When he arrived, the church was empty. One at a time, the black leaders began to enter. Amid an uneasy silence, Will rose to the pulpit. The quiet poet suddenly transformed himself into an angry preacher. "You sit before me, sour and full of hatred," Will declared. "You think I am the murderer. I am not the murderer. That foolish young policeman is not the murderer. The murderer is you. Your hands are dripping with blood."
It was the most amazing speech that he could have made to the African American community. After all they had endured, after all the work they had done, he told them that the city of Greenville had saved them. The city of Greenville had fed them. And how did they pay white folks back? They paid them back by being lazy, being indolent, and refusing to work. He demanded that they all get on their knees and pray to God to forgive them for the murder of that poor black man. And if you're going to keep your heel on the neck of thousands and thousands of people and keep them as downtrodden laborers, ultimately you can't be nice about it. And that's what Leroy Percy knew when it came down to it. And that's what Will Percy was finding out and going along with.
the fragile bond between the Percys and Delta blacks was broken. Our people have the most troubling road to travel, Leroy wrote to a friend. Some will be able to make it. Many, broken and discouraged, will fail. In a year and a half, Leroy Percy was dead. His dream of empire swept away with the torrent of water. Shortly after his speech at the church, Will Percy resigned as head of the Greenville Relief Committee. The following day, he left the Delta for an extended trip to Japan. He would return to Greenville to rebuild his father's plantation. There, Will would live and die in the house where he was born. He would never write poetry again. For many African Americans, the flood of 1927 marked the end of an era and the start of a journey. As the Mississippi River finally retreated to its banks, they began heading north.
When you go north, there were chances of work, getting something. If they had remained there with cotton 50 cents a pound and meat, meal, and molasses, how long could they have existed?
So many people wanted to leave there to go to Chicago. And I believe some of them rode free, so many of them got on the trains. In Greenville, you had the train was at ground level. And they were just all around waiting, pushing to get on the train. I sure didn't want to go to Chicago. Everybody was going but me. They just knew they were going to the promised land.
A great river of humanity was flowing out of the Delta. Within a year of the flood, tens of thousands of sharecroppers would turn their backs on the planters of the Delta. The exodus Leroy Percy had feared so long could not be stopped.
There's more about the flood on American Experience Online. See footage of the 1927 flood and compare it to other Mississippi River disasters. All this and more at PBS Online, pbs.org, America Online keyword PBS. To order Fatal Flood on video cassette or other programs from American Experience, call 1-800-PLAY-PBS. Next time on American Experience.
He honestly believed that he had a calling to make money.
He made millions at any cost.
The people who did find him ruthless had reason to find him ruthless.
But his sons and grandsons would pay the price, redeeming the family name. An American dynasty, the Rockefellers. Next time on American Experience. American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
At the Scotts Company, we help make gardens more beautiful, lawns greener, trees taller. If there's a better business to be in, please let us know.
Liberty Mutual Insurance is a proud supporter of the American experience. And by helping people live safer, more secure lives, we're also proud supporters of the American dream.
And by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is PBS.
Coming in April on American Experience. More than any other artist of the century, he would help transform the meaning of wilderness in America and change what people thought and felt about their own land. As a boy, he had been forever changed by the beauty and power of the American landscape. He would spend his life capturing it on film. Ansel Adams. The story of John Nash, the inspiration for A Beautiful Mind.
John Nash perhaps was the greatest mathematical mind of this generation.
A mathematical genius.
He'd been eccentric, but there was no hint that it would shade over into fully delusional, psychotic behavior.
A descent into madness.
Madness can be an escape. So not so good, you maybe want to imagine something better.
A mysterious recovery. He would win the Nobel Prize. John Nash. A Brilliant Madness. This April on American Experience.
Broadcast of the American Experience on Vermont Public Television is supported in part by the Lane Press, printer since 1904, providing full production and distribution services for magazines and catalogs. By Cellular One, Vermont's provider of cellular paging and long-distance services. Cellular One reminds you, whenever you're on the road with your wireless phone, your first responsibility is to drive safely. By Page Designs, Burlington's award-winning socially responsible creative communication firm, offering graphic design, writing, and website development services that help businesses in the Northeast grow and thrive. Funding has also been provided by contributing members like you.
You're watching viewer-supported Vermont Public Television, where you belong. Vermont's hills will come alive with the sounds of the world's most beloved musical, The Sound of Music. Now watch the play live in the Lyric Theater Company's presentation of The Sound of Music, April 11th through the 14th at the Flynn Center in Burlington. Call 802-86-FLYNN for tickets and information. Presented with media support from Vermont Public Television.
Have you ever thought about leaving a lasting legacy? Something that will have a positive impact on your community long after you're gone? You might consider becoming a member of Vermont Public Television's Golden Circle Legacy Society.